Welcome, BrookingsBiology students, to our new unit about cell structure and function. We're going to learn about cell parts and what they do inside of a cell. I'm going to ask you to get out your flipbook, your cell flipbook that you put together, and your cell diagram, the picture, the big picture that has the drawings of the cells on it. And we're going to use that as we go through this slideshow. I'm going to ask you to set your flipbook aside for a moment. We're going to talk about some of the things we need to know, and then we're going to stop and put the information into our flipbook, and then we'll do a little coloring as we go through and talk about the cell parts. So if we start out talking about cells, it kind of connects to our last chapter when we learned about all those different kinds of molecules and atoms making those molecules. So we're going to kind of make a little continuum here. We started in our last chapter talking about atoms, and especially atoms that are important for living things like carbon and oxygen and hydrogen and nitrogen. And then in our last chapter, we took those atoms and we put them together to make molecules, things like phospholipids and carbohydrates and proteins. And now this chapter, we're going to take our molecules and put them together to make organelles, little pieces inside of a cell that have a function. You have organs in your body, things like stomach and liver and brain and lungs. Each of those organs does a specific job for you. And the ending L, E-L-L-E, means little or tiny, small. And so cells have little parts inside of them that do jobs as well, have specific functions, and we call them organelles. And I know back in middle school you learned about some different kinds of organelles. And so we're going to start out by doing the first page in our flipbook. We said in our last chapter the cell was the basic unit, the smallest little piece of something that shows those characteristics of life. And so scientists have kind of put our understanding of what we know about cells and living things together into what we call the cell theory. A theory is a big idea, an explanation that takes lots of data, lots of evidence from a variety of places and kind of combines it together into an explanation or a big idea of our understanding about that thing. So we're going to talk about cell theory. Living things are made of cells. We learned that in our last chapter. That was one of the characteristics of living things. And we said cells are the basic unit of structure and function. They're the smallest little piece of something that's alive, basic unit of life. We learned that one in our last chapter as well. The new part of the cell theory that we haven't talked about yet is this part, that new cells are produced from the division of existing cells. You did a chapter on mitosis in middle school and learned about how cells copy their chromosomes and divide and make new cells. And those three ideas make up the cell theory. If you look at cells and compare them under the microscope, and this is kind of a generality, not all cells, all plant cells are bigger than all animal cells, but plant cells are usually the biggest type of cell. If you look at an average plant cell under a microscope, it's bigger than an average animal cell. Like I said, there are some exceptions. The smallest type of cell is a bacterial cell. Bacteria are small enough that they can get inside your body and sometimes get inside your cells. So we know that they have to be the smallest kind of cell. Okay, I'm going to ask you to put your flipbook aside for a minute and just listen as we walk through and talk about some things for our from our slideshow. We said all living things are made of cells, and if you look at cells under the microscope, basically there's two kinds of cells, and I know that you learned about these in middle school, so dust off your brain a little bit. It's in there somewhere. Cells that do not have a nucleus, or organelles, little pieces surrounded by membranes, we call them membrane-bound organelles, are called prokaryotes. Cells with a nucleus that have all those little tiny cell organelles made from membranes, surrounded by membranes, are called eukaryotes. You are a eukaryote. Your cells have a nucleus. DNA is enclosed in a nucleus, and you have little pieces, little cell parts inside of your cells that have different functions. Does that mean a bacteria cell, a prokaryote, can't do all those functions that our cells can do? They have many of the functions that we have. They're not as complicated inside, but they also can carry out many of the functions that eukaryotes do. Notice bacteria cells are prokaryotes, animal cells and plant cells are eukaryotes. So let's talk a little bit about some of those cell parts. If you remember back from our last chapter when we talked about all those different kinds of molecules, we said one of the functions or one of the jobs that proteins have and phospholipids have is to make cell membranes. Remember those little phospholipids with the heads and tails that hang down? Cell membranes are made mainly of those two molecules, proteins and phospholipids. And we also learned that in our last chapter. That was one of the questions on our last chapter test. What are the main components that make cell membranes? If you remember, we talked about this molecule in our last chapter. This is a phospholipid. Remember, it has a head part with a phosphate group that's very philic, likes to hang out with water, very polar, and it has tails that hang down that are very hydrophobic, don't like water, want to stay away from water, very nonpolar. And it makes this molecule act in some very interesting ways because one part of the molecule wants to be near water and the other part of the molecule wants to stay away from water. And it gives it some very unique properties. If you take oil and water, remember we talked about making Italian dressing or seeing those puddles in the parking lot after it rains and you see the oil floating on the top. Remember, oil and water don't mix very well. So if I take a phospholipid, which is, remember, very phobic on the tail part, and throw it into water, what will happen is that molecule will orient itself to try and make it so the tails, those phobic tails, don't touch the water. If they form a layer on the top, they'll stand on their heads with the tails sticking up in the air. If they can also form little spheres with the tails toward the center and the polar heads, the I like water heads facing outwards. You're seeing a little cross section here. You gotta think 3D now. This is a 3D shape. Think like a ball or a sphere. But you're looking inside, and notice here all of our tails are towards the center and all of our heads are on the outside touching the water. It makes it so those phobic tails can stay away from the water. We're going to watch a little animation to see how that works. And if you look at this little animation, what we're showing is what happens to those phospholipids. If I put a phospholipid into water, remember the heads like water, they're going to want to touch and be near the water. But those phobic tails do not like water. They want to stay as far away from water, and they actually will stand on their heads and stick those phobic tails up away from the water. If you do a little shake them up, you can get them to form those little spheres. They're called micelles. And a micelle is a little sphere made out of phospholipids that has the tails facing toward the center and the heads on the outside touching the water. Remember, you got to think of this as 3D now. If you add a lot of phospholipids where they can't all stand on their heads, what will happen is they can actually form a double layer. It's called a bilayer. Bi means two. Remember, think bicycle. Bi means two. It's called a phospholipid bilayer. And notice now, you have water on both sides. Water on both sides. Your heads are oriented so they can touch the water. And your tails are in the middle, kind of like a sandwich, where the heads would be the bread and the middle would be whatever is in your sandwich, like peanut butter, and makes a boundary, right? It allows us to separate. And one of the things we learn about our molecules, remember, lipids are molecules, the only big macromolecule that don't like water, and it allows you to make barriers and make compartments and make containers inside of your cell because of those phospholipids. Okay, they can form micelles, they can form bilayers, and it's because of those phobic tails trying to stay away from the water. Okay, let's go back to our slideshow a little bit and talk a little bit more about cell membranes. Because remember, we said membranes are made of not only phospholipids but also proteins, and we have some vocab that goes with that. Some proteins just stick on the surface of the cell. Look at this little red guy. It doesn't actually go into the cell membrane. It's sitting on the surface. Okay? And we call proteins that do that peripheral proteins. Peripheral proteins. When you go to the eye doctor and have your vision checked, one of the things they often do is say, look straight forward, and then they move a finger toward the side and see how far can they move the finger back before you can not see it anymore. That's your peripheral vision on the sides. And proteins that just stick on the surface are called peripheral proteins. Some proteins actually stick into that phospholipid membrane layer, either all the way through, they go all the way through to touch both sides, or they can go partially through and be anchored in the cell membrane. And if they are in part of the membrane, sticking into the membrane, we call them integral proteins, either part way through or all the way through. Integral proteins are important. We're going to see them do some very important jobs in cells in our coming chapters and in this chapter. The other protein that's important that we learned about in our last chapter that's part of cell membranes is this one. It's called a glycoprotein. Remember, it has a protein part, an anchor that holds it in the cell membrane, and then it has these little sugar, glucose, sugar components. Remember, glycoproteins are important in recognizing self. They have a protein, they have a protein component, and they have a sugar component, and their job is to recognize they're part of our immune system defense, recognizing things that are not supposed to be in our body, that aren't like me, and helping our body to get rid of those, destroy those. One of the important things that those membrane proteins do is they act as transporters. Remember when we talked about protein functions in our last chapter, things that proteins can do, and we said they can help move things in and out of cells, and the way they do that is by providing doorways or passageways through the cell membrane to allow things to get in and out. We're going to do a whole chapter about transport and see how things move in and out of cells in our next chapter. The function, what a cell membrane does for a cell, is it acts as a boundary. Because those phospholipids don't like water, they can make a barrier. The membrane doesn't dissolve in water. It makes a compartment inside the cell and separates the outside from the inside. And because not everything can pass through a membrane, it controls what is going in and out, getting in and out of our cell. Cell membranes, when we have to think about living cells, we have to kind of change our thinking about how they actually look and move in real life, because oftentimes we see pictures of cells or pictures in a book, and it's kind of a snapshot, a frozen in time picture. We don't really think about that this is a moving, living thing. And so those molecules that are in cell membranes don't just stay put. When you take a picture of yourself with your friends or standing in front of something, it looks in the picture like you're not moving, but most of the time you do. And it's just because in a picture it kind of stops the action. But cell membranes are part of a living cell, and they also move and don't just stay in one place. So we're going to watch another little animation here. If you think about, here's those phospholipid heads and tails now, and proteins, glycoprotein, here's my little sugar sticking out, or other kinds of proteins in cell membranes. And we have to think about these as moving molecules. These are actually moving. They can move around in the cell membrane. They can slide. And so you got to remember that cells are living things. Okay, let's go back to our slideshow. What we have now, if we make a barrier or a dividing wall now, we're going to separate our cell into an inside part and an outside part. And the part that's inside that fills the cell is called the cytoplasm. It's the components of the cell, all those organelles inside, the goo that surrounds them, is called the cytoplasm. And remember, organelles are little structures inside the cell that have a specific job to do. And they're suspended or floating kind of in a jello-like goo. If you've ever seen jello that sat out on the counter and kind of got a little bit runny, that's the kind of, think about the consistency that would be inside. Kind of a thick goo that surrounds all the organelles that are floating inside. It's called cytoplasm. Okay, I'm going to ask you to go to your cell membrane page, plasma membrane page in your Flipbook, and we're going to fill in some important things. So find your Flipbook and look for the little page that says cell membranes, also called the plasma membrane. And we're going to put some notes down. Remember, we said mainly made of phospholipids and proteins. And if you look now, you have a little picture of a cell membrane. And remember those little heads with the tails, those phospholipids. Those phobic tails are going to line up. They make the phospholipids line up so it makes a bilayer. When it's in water, it's going to make a bilayer because those phobic tails don't want to touch the water. And so they line up in a double layer. Notice you have phospholipids here and you have phospholipids on top. 2 layers together like a sandwich. The heads, the polar heads that like water, facing outward, touching the water, and the tails facing in towards the middle of the sandwich. The proteins that make up cell membranes, and we're going to learn about a few. We're going to put some vocab here. Remember, the peripheral proteins are the ones that stick on the inside or outside surface. They don't actually go into the bilayer. They're called peripherals. The ones that go into the membrane, either part way or all the way through, are called integral proteins. Think of for a second, what's our other kind of proteins that are found in cell membranes that are important in recognizing self? Remember, they have a protein part and a sugar part. They're called glycoproteins. And glycoproteins are also important components of all cell membranes. Other proteins that are important in cell membranes that we're going to focus on are the transport proteins. They're proteins that are moving things in and out of cells across the membrane. Membranes are what we call selectively permeable. Selectively permeable. And to select means you're picking, you're choosing. And permeable means to allow something to pass. If it's a permeable substance, it lets something pass through it. And the other word that kind of goes with that, it means the same thing for our purposes, is called semi. Semi means kind of permeable. And so because membranes are selectively permeable, they allow certain molecules to pass through and they keep others out. So it controls what can get in and out of the cell membrane. And that's very important to maintaining, remember our vocab word from last chapter? Maintaining homeostasis in the cell. Transporting, making sure that the cell has everything that it needs, maintaining the balance of water and ions and food in the cell, all the protein molecules and sugar molecules. All of that balance, that homeostasis is in part regulated and controlled by the cell membrane, what it's allowing in and what it's keeping out. And our other vocab that goes on this with cell membranes is cytoplasm, because once I make a membrane, a boundary, then I can put stuff inside, and that's my cytoplasm. All the goo and the organelles that are inside the cell between the nucleus and the cell membrane. Okay, we're going to take a break here and stop, and we're going to add cell membranes to our picture. So I'm going to ask you to find your cell picture, and you should have markers on your table, And what we are going to do is to do a little coloring of cell membrane. So notice in your picture now, you have an animal cell, a typical animal cell. You have a plant cell, and you have a bacterial cell. Notice the size of them. Remember we said plants are a little bit, average plant cells a little bit bigger than an animal cell. These are a little bit bigger than bacterial cells. So I'm going to ask you to pick a color, and we're going to color code this picture. So I'm going to ask you to pick a color and choose to be your cell membrane color. And so we're going to color in our cell the cell part, cell membrane. So I'm going to ask you to choose a color. I'm going to pick yellow. And we're going to start with our animal cell. And this animal cell has been sliced now in half, kind of like an orange. So I can see the outside edge of the cell. And I can also see the inside part of my cell. So I'm going to ask you to pick a color to be your cell membrane color. And you don't have to use the same one that I do, but we're going to kind of color code our picture here. So I'm going to ask you to color in the cell membrane in your animal cell. And we're going to, as you go through this and watch this video, if you need to stop the video and pause it along the way till you get your cell colored, I'm going to keep going and keep talking. But if you need a little more coloring time, take a second and hit pause till you get your cell membrane. Notice this is a 3D picture now. You can see the edge of the cell membrane on this side, and you can see the surface over here. And membrane is going around the outside of my animal cell. Bacteria also have a cell membrane. All cells have a cell membrane. So I'm going to follow this little line here. This is my cell membrane on my bacteria cell. And now plants, be careful now, because it looks kind of like you got that same surface, just like on our animal cell. But plants have an extra layer on the outside of their cell membrane. So look really carefully before you start to color. Here is where I think I gotta make my line a little bit smaller. Here is where my cell membrane is in a plant cell. It's not the actual outermost layer. It's this little layer right here on the inside. Because plants have an extra layer, a cell wall outside of their cell membrane. So we're going to color just this little inside line. Little inside line here. And so notice all these three kinds of cells all have a cell membrane. If you look on your little label here now, all cells, we're going to color code this so we can tell what our parts are, what colors go with what parts. So I'm going to ask you to use your same color you colored your cell membrane, and we're going to color in the name label cell membrane. Cell membrane. Or you can underline it, or make a box around it, circle it. Somehow we want to remember that that's my cell membrane is that color. We're going to stop right here, and we're going to stay tuned for more slideshows about more organelles in cells, and thanks for listening.